iPredict works by gathering the knowledge of its 5,000 plus traders. If a stock has a price of 57 cents, that means the market thinks that event has a 57% chance of happening. If you agree, you buy. If you disagree, you short. And if you're right, you make money. Kia ora, good evening New Zealand. Welcome to the iPredict post-election 2011 1-hour special, the most accurate source of political and economic information in New Zealand broadcasting. Tonight we look at three issues. Issue 1, how did the iPredict market rate against the mainstream media landline polls, and what does it suggest for the future of opinion polling? Issue 2, what went right and what went wrong for the opposition parties, and who will emerge as the new leader of the Labour Party? Issue 3, how much of a mandate does the government now have, and we question National's lacklustre campaign strategy. To dissect these issues, let me introduce tonight's first guest panellist. He is Matt Burgess, the CEO of iPredict, and joining me throughout the show, Matthew Hooton, NBR political columnist and moral shepherd of the right. Welcome to you both. Matt, we had Michelle Levine from Roy Morgan on this show last week defending the inherent bias of landline opinion polls. iPredict called the result for National and Labour 12 months ago. How will accurate market opinion polls impact the flawed mainstream media landline polls?
Well, actually, iPredict called the election 3 years ago.
Oh, right, was that?
And got it right. I hate to brag, but
Yep.
we were right on the money 3 years ago as well. Yeah, I think the issue with landline polls is that there are fewer people with landlines, and even people with them are less inclined to answer your poll when you call up. So the problem for polling is you've got to fill in all the gaps that you can't see, an extremely difficult process, and that's part of the reason you see a lot of variation, and in at least one case, extraordinary variation between the polls.
Because the polls were suggesting 50 plus for most of the 3 years, and right from the beginning, iPredict was saying only 47, 48.
That's right. Actually, when you look at the line over the last 14 months, it was pretty steady between about 45 and 48. Only spiked over 50 every now and then, and I guess probably every two out of three polls were saying national 50 plus.
That's right.
So we were sitting up at iPredict HQ wondering who's right. And one of the nice things about that is that it's a real test of what you're doing. If everybody's saying the same thing, well it's all much of muchness. So. We've had an absolutely fantastic result in the election over the weekend. We nailed the National Party vote.
Matthew, if the mainstream media opinion polls are manipulating public opinion rather than reflecting it, and this in turn creates low voter participation, then as much as it grates against my post-anarchist, environmental activist, Marxist soul, the accuracy provided by the iPredict market is a means to counter that media-generated sense of electoral inevitability, isn't it?
Look, iPredict is always going to outperform traditional polls because the market is going to take into account all that information, plus information from people who are doing private polls, plus people's political judgment about what might happen through a campaign. And I think what would have happened is that the traders in iPredict assumed that something would happen to bring National's support down during the election campaign. Probably were taking into account issues like you keep highlighting, the landline issue. So iPredict has always got, it's much richer. Plus what it's doing is it's not saying, how do you personally think you would have voted yesterday, as a poll does. What it says is, how do you think the community is going to vote in a year's time? And that means people are thinking in a richer way than just responding to their own opinion on a particular day.
You've had some angry feedback from the opinion pollsters?
Well, there's iPredict issued a press statement today that points out how much it outperformed the traditional polls, and I think there's a lack of understanding of iPredict works. But to be fair to the traditional pollsters, they do their polls in good faith. They put together the report to their client, the TV station or the newspaper, and what they'll say is, this is where support was over the last week for the various parties. What then happens, though, is the TV journalists say that these are a forecast.
That's right.
Well, they're not forecasts, and the polling companies, to be fair to them, don't claim they're a forecast. The only forecasts of the election result are those on iPredict.
Do you think the media have a role to actually start explaining the polling situation better to their viewers? Because the perception that it was just a sleepwalk to victory for for the National Party was one that became quite ingrained, wasn't it?
Yeah, it certainly was. And actually, one of the things on iPredict we were running was, election winner, and it was always stuck in the low 90s. And as dominant as key was, at least through the media's eyes, we always looked at that 92 and wondered, well, where's the other 8%? And I think we saw it in the final week of the election when things did get a little closer, and it could have actually gone either way. I think actually polls will always be around. There is a role for them even with prediction markets, and actually there's not a lot of overlap between what polls do and what prediction markets do. Vote share is pretty much the only place. So polls are great if you're asking for opinion. What are mums between the age of 45 and 50 think of John Key?
Right.
That's not a question you can ask on a that's right.
Apparently so.
But you wouldn't get that answer from a prediction market. But you would get an answer to a question like who's going to go into coalition with who after the election. Also an important question. Much harder to ask on a poll. So I think actually they're complements.
And this is what iPredict's doing now in the next few days as John Key brings together his government and also as the Labor Party discusses its leadership issues. iPredict has now got news stocks that have been launched since the election asking who's going to be in the cabinet, who's going to be the Minister of Finance, who's going to be the Minister of Fisheries or Education, and who's going to be the next leader of the Labor Party. I mean, this is fantastically rich information that the news media should actually be reporting on, I think, far more than they do their own speculations, because we know that the Beehive staff trade in these stocks. We know that the Labor Party staff trade in these stocks, plus the sectors do so. There's various experts in their fields thinking, and political analysts thinking, well, say Anne Tolley hasn't done too well, so I expect her price will be discounted. Well,
certainly, you'd have to,
polls
surely.
are never going to be able to pick up that type of information.
Biggest surprise from the market?
Well, I think actually it was the National Party vote share.
Yep.
So here are we sitting on 48, between 45 and 48 all the year in the last month, right on 48 after poll after poll after poll coming out saying 50
plus,
up to 57.
Yeah,
an enormous difference. That's right. And yet when the polls came back, when the punters went to...
I thought you were an economist, you meant to believe in Martyn.
Well, it tests your faith when you see all those polls saying 50-something, and here are we on 48, and the traders on iPredict got it absolutely right, to their great credit, actually.
Biggest surprise from the...
Well, I'd say the same. The average on iPredict over the last 3 months was exactly 48, and National got 47.99. It means that... the National Party, iPredict got the National Party's vote wrong by 0.01%. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. The other thing I think is there's been a lot of criticism. I think Mike Williams, who's joining us shortly, has sort of said, well, but aren't these polls where people have to pay to be in them? So wouldn't that bias the right wing over the left? In fact, iPredict, if anything, a marginally underestimated National support and marginally overestimated Labor's support. So it just shows the strength of the market. That there's no bias towards the centre-right at all, because what you have is people trading not what they think.
It's what they think other people
other people are thinking.
Yeah.
And even the pollsters sometimes ask that question.
Yeah.
If you ask, I understand on polls, if there was another $1 million available for government spending, how would you like it spent? And people will say health and education. But if you ask them if there was another $1 million to be spent, how would your neighbour want it spent? They say, oh, tax cuts. And what that is revealing a preference, because everyone's sort of been trained to parrot health and education and answer that question when the landline polls call them.
What were your reflections of the election?
Well, we actually had a very busy election. This is our second election through. We launched just before the last election in 2008. And actually it went really well. I mean, the one thing about running a prediction market is getting through an election alive. You go to prediction market conferences and everyone's got a story about their site going down at exactly the wrong moment. So we got through in one piece. I think the best thing about actually what's happened is that in 2008 we were the second most accurate forecaster amongst the pollsters. This time, number one. Do
you think 2014 iPredict will have a much more dominant role in terms of the media coverage of the election?
As great as the media has been to iPredict, I'm constantly amazed that we don't get picked up more. We have so much data, and you get these tremendous charts showing dips and spikes. National announces its asset sale policy, and suddenly Labor's up 3 points that day. Yeah. It's tremendous information that you can't get any other way. Yeah. And there's so much
on
you can do with
that point, I had a political editor of a major news organisation that I won't name because it's so embarrassing for that person and they're a friend of mine. A week before the election, they rang to ask me what iPredict's sample size was. So we do have a press gallery and I think a political class that just doesn't understand this. And I think one of the things that would be good is if the university, Victoria University of Wellington, perhaps held a seminar for the press gallery to explain how it works, because that would improve the quality of political reporting in this country.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, panel. We'll see you after the break to discuss what went right and what went wrong for the opposition parties and who will emerge as the new leader of the Labour Party with political strategist Mike Williams. Kia ora, welcome back to the iPredict post-election 2011 1-hour special, the most accurate source of political and economic information in New Zealand broadcasting. On the panel is NBR political columnist and moral shepherd of the right, Matthew Hooton, and joining us to discuss what happened to the opposition parties and who will emerge as the next leader of the Labour Party, Mike Williams. Mike, Winston is back, and he's brought a cavalcade of political circus freaks with him. Winston's desire to be the new voice of the opposition could be sidetracked by any number of political nightmare scandals currently brewing in the blogosphere. How effective is New Zealand First going to be?
You've got to remember New Zealand First is a one-man band, and these are sort of ring and support cast for Winston. It will be very effective because Winston will be very effective, and Winston is very annoyed. He was hounded out of office by the National Party, and he's thirsting for Hooton, and he will get it.
Is this redemption for Winston?
Of a sort, I think, yes. I think a lot of the accusations made up against him before the last election were actually unfair and unfounded, and one of them, I can tell you, simply was untrue. But certainly he is ready to go after National in a big way.
What was the untrue one?
I'm not going to say that.
We won't get into that because you'll rip it to pieces. What do you think in terms of his economic sovereignty arguments? That is going to be quite devastating in the asset sale situation.
Oh, I think that's an argument that's starting to resonate, economic sovereignty, and I think it will come up in the asset sales because I don't see any way that that the national government can stop those shares walking overseas. And a lot of people are saying, you know, I'm going to buy them, I'll stag it and sell out just as soon as I can. And a lot of the big pension funds would love to have a slice of that.
With Winston back, does he overshadow the other opposition parties?
He may do, but, you know, there's always a possibility of the new Labour Party leader and Winston doing a double act, because he does things that no responsible leader of the opposition would do.
Matthew, is Conservative Party leader Colin Craig off the National Party Christmas card list?
I'm not sure he was ever on it, but yeah, he got 2 point something of the vote, and one argument is that that was votes that otherwise would have gone to National or ACT, and therefore he made this election far closer, because after all, John Key only really won by a seat or two than it might otherwise have been, at huge expense. I mean, he poured an enormous amount of money into this campaign, and good on him. A lot of it seemed to be spent north of the Harbour Bridge on the party vote campaign. But there's another argument that says a lot of these religious conservatives may not otherwise have voted anyway. Some of them actually might come from lower socioeconomic areas, more than you think, in the Pacific community. Plus, if you look at his platform, he too was putting forward an economic nationalist campaign. I mean, obviously the number one overriding issue for Mr. Craig is smacking.
Of course.
Because he sees that as some vital strategic interest to this country in terms of its economic and social destiny. But once he's past that issue, it takes quite a while to get him past that issue, then it is actually quite a left-wing program that his so-called Conservative Party put together. Question
to both of you. Did Peter Dunne just become relevant?
Oh, he's still relevant. He's half of National's majority.
That's right, that's right.
Yeah.
So Peter needs some love. He
he
hasn't had a lot of it.
Well, no, they'll give him a portfolio outside of Cabinet and probably revenue, and he'll be perfectly happy with that. And I'd have to say that he had some responsibility for drug law in the last Parliament, and I interfaced with him in my previous job, and I found him very effective.
You mean pharmaceuticals or illegal drugs?
No, it was it's illegal drugs, illicit drugs.
Shouldn't he be asking for more? Shouldn't his ambition be a little higher than the dregs that he's getting?
Well,
I mean,
no,
he's one half of their majority.
He doesn't have anywhere to go. Mike would have a better view of this, but I don't think Labor would ever feel that comfortable accepting him back, even though he's supported them before. He's a funny guy, isn't he? He wants to be, his life's ambition seems to be Minister of Revenue.
Yes.
And he's been it, I think, for at least 2 Prime Ministers, if not 3 now. And, you know, he likes to be the tax collector for whoever is Prime Minister. I mean, most people go into politics, if they're Labor, they want to spend, you know, and they want to be the one that hands out the taxpayers' lollies. Or if they're National, they might want to cut tax or something and reduce. But to be the guy that just likes to administer the IRD, well, each to their own. And I guess in his part of where he comes from, there's a lot of public servants where he works, and maybe they find the design of the tax form and the income tax amendment bill number 62 terribly fascinating out in Johnsonville. But
question to both of you. John Banks as corrections minister, just what prisons needed, a law and order sadist. I feel like I've woken up at a Ku Klux Klan rally wearing a Lady Gaga t-shirt. What happened to the moderate government?
Well, is he corrections minister? I would be very sad if he was, because Bill English earlier this year in March said something very enlightened. He said prisons are a moral and fiscal failure, and I think that's a very brave thing for a Conservative politician to say. So I think the chances of John Banks being Minister of Corrections are slight. I have, you know, Judith Collins talks tough, but she's actually done a couple of good things in the prison sphere. One, I went to the opening of a drug rehab centre in Perimarima Jail. She's putting money into that. And secondly, she announced briefly, shortly before the election, that they were going to extend mental health checks to all prisoners, you know, not just the obviously deranged ones. And these are steps in the right direction. Now, John Banks and corrections would be a massive leap backwards.
Well, it all depends, though. Look, it all depends on which John Banks we're talking about. Are we talking about the sort of Muldoonist law and order conservative John Banks, or are we talking about the leader of the ACT Party? Because perhaps if he's the leader of the ACT Party, he would be someone who would be very enthusiastic about the concept of public partnerships, PPPs with private prisons, which are incentivised to reduce recidivism and so forth.
Well, incentivised to have longer and harder sentences.
Well, no, because their contracts are actually quite liberal. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't make sense. Bill English was profoundly right when he said prisons were a moral and fiscal failure, particularly the fiscal side. Well, on the moral side, it's if you send someone to prison, the rest of your social system has failed them, as has their family, for that ever to happen. But from the fiscal point of view, I know that Bill English is deeply concerned about this. It's the fastest growing of government expenditure.
It's a monster department.
And at the moment, just at the moment, increasing expenditure is not on the government's priority list. So,
how effective, question to both of you, how effective is Hone going to be in 3 years? Can he build mana into a movement?
I don't think there's any sign of that. They got 1% of the vote. He did manage to get candidates. He has a brilliant organiser sitting beside him in Matt McCartan. Matt McCartan's up there with Sir George Chapman, in my view, in terms of being able to create organisational structures. Matt is not well. He looked buggered on election night. I'm allowed to use that word. I think he'll spin his wheels. If he didn't make some traction in this election when Labor was historically weak, he never will.
Right. They had 3 months to get it up and running, and only got 1,500 votes shy of the ACT Party
there's
vote.
Just one MP here in the form of Hone Harawira, and it's very, very sad in a sense because you've got Winston Peters, and he's brought in 7 dwarfs with him. And basically that means the taxpayer will be funding the New Zealand First Party eightfold over what it will be funding the Mana Party. And any which way you look at it, Hone Harawira is a more honest and important political figure than Winston Peters, and has more to offer the Parliament than Winston Peters. I mean, for these 8 salaries going to these people, Winston and his 7 dwarfs, I mean, he's just going to use the benefit of parliamentary privilege, debate his enemies, and have fun. He's going to be the class clown.
That's a very good point from Matthew. There's not only 8 salaries. There's at least one staff, and they've all got one staff member in Wellington and one at their home base. So it's it's the multiplier effect. Really gives you an organisation.
The Greens finally broke 10%. What can they actually achieve as the 3rd largest political party?
I get crumbs off the National Party's table, and they'll skite about it as they've done with their home insulation program.
Right. They're going to get bugger all, aren't they?
Well, they'll get some things. They're not needed in the government. They've said they prefer the Labor Party than the National Party. They, for political reasons, don't want to get too close to National, so they probably don't want too much. But iPredict was predicting roughly 10% all year, and got the Green vote incredibly accurate when you average it over the last 3 months. So it's an historic achievement for them. It's a great credit to Russell Norman. I think the focus on the economy was a very smart thing. I thought their Richer New Zealand campaign was a fantastic campaign. And of course, they're here now, and they too will be now getting more resources. They will have offices, more offices around the country, more MPs, more staff. So I think they could build, unless Labor really gets its act together, and we're not yet sure that Labor is prepared to think deeply about what it is and what its future might be. The Greens could continue growing.
In terms of the Labor Party leadership, in light of their terrible 27%, surely the Labor conclave need to accept that the position must be decided by meritocracy and not handed out for time served in the party. The question must be, who can win 2014, and in that regards, who will it be? Mike, 800,000 New Zealanders didn't bother voting. Politics is visceral. It inspires people. Phil Goff ran a bloody good campaign, and he is arguably the nicest Prime Minister we never had. But the next leader must have charisma, right? Cunliffe's performance in the media was one of the few victories for Labor. Why doesn't he have party faction support?
Cunliffe? Oh, he may well have. There's quite a battle going on at the moment, and it's my reading of it, and I'm not fully in touch because obviously some MPs went out and some new ones have come in, but it looks very even to me, and that's the debate that's happening now.
And where do you think the debate's going to go?
I don't know. I said to Matthew this morning, caucus votes are actually very rare. There was one this year that I know of, and that was for the caucus, Labor Party caucus representative on the moderating committee, and that was a dead heat between David Parker and David Cunliffe, and it was decided by the toss of a coin. So that gives you some idea of the temperature of the caucus.
And so will the caucus be looking at someone who's done their time for loyalty in terms of, you've done your time, you get handed it, or who's going to win 2014? Oh,
it's definitely, they've got to recover from this disastrous 27% of the vote, and they'll be looking at somebody who can foot it with John Key.
But I'm not sure this is a meritocracy situation for Labor, because I think that Labor begins the next 3-year journey to the next election as the overwhelming favourite. I think National is probably has the most popular Prime Minister in history, and yet it only won by 1 or 2 seats. So you'd have to say, balance of probabilities, Labor will win the next election. And so that's why I guess Cunliffe and Parker will go hammer and tongs, because they are probably fighting for the Prime Ministership. And who's the better guy isn't really going to come into it. It's going to be who's offering ministers jobs and baubles of office.
Matthew, one of your hobbies is the destabilisation of David Cunliffe.
Oh, but surely not.
It's a hobby, well, maybe a calling of yours. But even you would have to admit he was fantastic on TV, and the rank and file of Labor really like him. Why is Team Grant Robertson, David Parker a better punt?
Well, I'm not sure where you saw him on TV that you thought he performed well. I thought his behaviour on election night...
Oh, no, he was good on Q&A.
Well, he did very well.
Paul Holmes said that.
He also failed dismally to answer those fiscal questions that led to all those problems for Labor, when Mr Goff was basically set up at the press debate.
But versus Grant versus Parker versus him? Grant Robertson versus
Well, Grant Robertson and Jacinda Ardern is the ticket that Trevor Mallard has been pushing. Obviously, Jacinda's failure to win Auckland Central from Nikki Kay means she's probably off it. But what Trevor and I think Mike Smith from the Labor Party, until he's changed his position, what he was saying on Friday was that Grant and Jacinda represent a generational change for Labor and will enable them to move on into the post-Helen Clark, post-Phil Goff world. Well, both Grant Robertson and Jacinda Ardern were staffers of Helen Clark. I mean, they owe everything to her. She appointed them. And secondly, the Labour Party, if they really think, if Trevor Mallard really thinks that the answer to Labour's current problems, particularly in provincial New Zealand, is the gay Wellington Central MP and the grey Lynn Liberal Jacinda Ardern, I mean, that is so politically retarded, but perhaps the Labour caucus will go for it.
Who are they going to look at for 2014? Because it has to be a figure who can unify the rest of the country. Someone who National Party voters would say, actually, I could vote for him. And there were really only a couple of handful of Labour MPs.
Well, my view is that that's either Cunliffe or Parker. I mean, I know both of them very well, and I was instrumental in David Parker coming into Parliament. Parker, brilliant commercial lawyer, the right-hand man of the richest man in the South Island, Howard Patterson. David Cunliffe.
He was not that. He was the lawyer that tidied up the paperwork afterwards.
Well,
anyway.
that's not what Howard Patterson told me.
Yes.
So I have it from the horse's mouth, and you can't disagree with me, Matt, because Howard's now dead. Cunliffe, Harvard educated, Boston Consulting. I think you've got some high-powered talent there, either of which could do the job.
The only problem with Cunliffe, I mean,
Another
it's
problem.
It's interesting that the Prime Minister's endorsed him.
Yes. that's caring of John.
Which is
that's
caring.
very
But it's
nice.
interesting, David.
But hang on, you've got to untangle that.
Yes.
John Key is going to endorse the candidate he doesn't want to see
That's
win.
right. Exactly.
Well,
exactly.
Aside from that, David Cunliffe is a guy who, throughout his career, in different places, the Foreign Ministry, the Boston Consulting Group, and in Parliament, a particular nickname for him has emerged that is unspeakable on this show.
Yes.
Right? But it's strange that particular nickname has emerged 3 times independently. When I first heard it, I thought it was something
Mr. Hooton,
I thought it was something the National Party had made up.
Yes.
But I understand that it was from his colleagues initially at the Foreign Ministry. I don't think he's a guy with sufficient people skills to get there.
Mr. Hooton, you have many nicknames as well. Mike, where does David Shearer play in all this? I mean, he is a rising star within the Labour Party.
He's a wild card, and I actually think he could be looked at as a deputy. His CV is unbelievable.
That's right.
He's got some sort of international award for bravery, and he's certainly been there, done that. He is... Problem with... you're looking at the job of head boy or head girl, and third formers need not apply.
Yeah.
I think that's the fallacy with Matthew's mad Jacinda Ardern.
No,
Grant
Trevor
Robertson.
Mallard. Trevor Mallard and Mike Smith's.
So I think that David Shearer is going to have a more prominent role in a revived Labour Party, and they're going to have to get out amongst the people because they're flirting with irrelevance in the provinces, and I think David Shearer has a lot of appeal to those kind of people.
What about Shearer? Where do you think he fits?
I think that third form line is sometimes true, but not always. Sometimes new MPs that come in are promoted before they're ready and they fail. But David Longing was promoted within 3 years of getting into Parliament.
That's right.
Don Brash became leader of the National Party within 18 months, and he added 17 points to National's poll rating.
So a parachute
and the ultimate third former who got to be head boy very, very quickly, of course, is John Key.
That's right.
I think Shearer is the best bet. He's not connected at all to the Helen Clark regime in the way the other 4 people we've been talking about are. I mean, David Parker was one of her closest friends. She went on holiday with him. And Cunliffe was her health minister, which is a portfolio that was very important to Helen Clark. And then there's the 2 others that were her own staff.
Hang on a
Labour
minute.
has to move on from the Helen Clark era.
There is an assumption in what you're saying that connection with Helen Clark is
a bad thing. That's right. Absolutely.
If you're a member of the Labour Party, what you know is only one leader won 3 elections in a row. That was Helen Clark. And I think one of the factors in the result on Saturday night was, in fact, there was a chunk of vote that was actually Helen Clark vote.
Well, there's an element of truth in all that, but if Labour wants to be re-elected, it has to be a Labour Party that is completely different to the Labour Party that's just been defeated. John Key took National to victory with a completely different National Party than the Bolger Shipley one that had been defeated. Clark was completely different from David Longy, Roger Douglas. Bolger was completely different from the Muldoon
That's right,
government.
that's right.
That if Labor thinks that just doing a Helen Clark retread on a bit of policy, a few ideas here, and bring all Helen Clark's disciples to the front bench, they have to change completely.
That's why Phil Goff has to lead the leadership changeover, right, as an actual debate.
They need to think, and the British Conservatives, they were always looking for the next Mrs. Thatcher, right? And it was only when it was no, because she had been so successful and very similar to Helen Clark in many ways, political style and so forth. And it was only when they got a brand new David Cameron through a 6-month leadership process that they changed. I think that David Shearer is by far the best candidate for the Labor leadership, but I think that they're not ready to take that step.
My dream team would be Cunliffe as leader up against Keeb, Shearer in finance, promoting rebuilding the middle class as an economic policy, and Leanne Dalziel as deputy to reconnect Labour with their traditional blue-collar support base. Mike, your final reflections for the 2011 election?
2011, well, the thing that jumps out at me is the huge stay-home vote, and I think that's a tragedy for democracy of New Zealand. I cannot find a lower turnout rate in the history of New Zealand, and I think that was driven by the perception that Labor couldn't win. You don't bother if you don't think your party can win. I think that had ramifications. Labor's long trailing of National in the polls also made normally Labor voters free to go and vote for Greens or Winston or something like that. And I think the new leader has really got to try and get Labor within cooey of National within a year, because I think one thing I agree with Matthew, if that doesn't happen, I think the leadership could be relitigated.
Surely, though, the other story for Labor of this election campaign is you've lost West Auckland for the first time in history. And that's a disaster for Labor. You've lost Chris Trotter's Waitakere man. You lost the party vote in New Lynn, in Waitakere, in Te Atatu. Yes, Carmel Septfit will only nearly won, but Paula Bennett, Tim Grosser and Tau Henare, they ran a party vote campaign and they beat your guys on the ground in West Auckland. You're in big trouble.
Yeah. Thank you, panel. We'll see you after the break to discuss how much of a mandate does the government now have, and we question National's lacklustre campaign performance with National Party MP Simon Burgess. Kia ora, welcome back to the iPredict post-election 2011 1-hour special, the most accurate source of political and economic information in New Zealand broadcasting. On the panel is MBR political columnist and moral shepherd of the right, Matthew Hooton, and joining us to discuss how much of a mandate the government now has, National Party MP Simon Burgess. Congratulations, Simon, on your extraordinary win and increased majority. This win for National is historic. Not since Muldoon, Longy and Bolger has a party taken a staggering 48%. However, asset sales as a policy are deeply disliked by the vast majority of the electorate. How much of a mandate does National have?
Well, firstly, let me acknowledge, I think the issue of what you get a mandate for does have some complexities. But let's be honest and blunt. If we haven't got a mandate for asset sales on 48% of the vote, when we started talking about it in January of this year, and Labor kept ramming the point home that we were all about asset sales, well, we haven't got a mandate for anything. So I think
that's kind of legit, isn't it?
Well, I mean, one of the things that New Zealanders were opposed to in the 1980s and 1990s was parties putting forward manifestos, or sometimes not putting them forward, and then not doing the things in their manifestos. Yeah. And I think, as Simon says, this was put in the National Party manifesto right up front. Exactly what is going to happen was promised. Labor then ran an entire campaign over it. Of course they have a mandate for it. And I think, look, that it was a very effective scare campaign. I admire Labor's advertising agency. I mean, they created an image in people's minds that the dams are going to be lifted up and taken off to China, right? That's what sort of... In the end, I think the issuing of shares worth 3% of the government's total portfolio, asset portfolio, is not going to be as disastrous and scary as some people think.
It's still politically risky for you, though, isn't it? In the sense that if the worst fears of the critics of asset sale come about and you do get this on-selling by New Zealanders overseas, it's going to be a very difficult thing for John Key to back down from, isn't it?
Oh, look, there's always risks in doing something like this. Actually, there's more risks if we didn't do it, because I think Matthew's point is right. If we didn't do it, look, we'd look like fools who aren't carrying through something we've been talking about, and look, the Labour Party talking about. I think one of the other interesting issues is the way this is going to be relitigated over the next months as we pass legislation to do this and so on and so forth. And the Winston Peters, I'm sure the Labour Party, the Greens will say we don't have a mandate. They want to go through the issues and the arguments. Look, I say actually we won the argument when we won the election. Yes, it's true that there are voters, national voters too, I'm sure, who have doubts about this, but they said to themselves, look, we're not so sure about this, but we trust John Key. We actually think he's got the leadership qualities to pull through on this, and we're going to back this and tick this anyway. We've won the argument.
Matthew, does John Key want a third term? How does he win it?
He wants a third term. I think he absolutely plans, because if you get 3 terms, 3 election victories, that's historic. That puts you in the top league, you know,
and he wants
with
to
the
be
Muldoons and the Hollyoaks and the Bulgers and the Clarks and so forth. So he will want to do that. Plus, he says that he'll keep the job until he feels he can't contribute anymore. Well, he's still got more to contribute. The question is not so much whether he will seek it, but whether he can get it.
Right.
And I think that National is in some trouble. ACT is now a ridiculous joke, where its leader clearly doesn't believe in its founding principles.
Yes.
You've then got Peter Dunn, which is never going to be more than just him. And the Maori Party, both its leaders are retiring. So National has absolutely no coalition partners. Now, for it to win the next election under those circumstances, it's going to have to get even more votes than it did on Saturday. Now, for goodness sake, going into your third term, to get even more votes than your second, when we're talking about a country that's now going to go through even more economic challenges as a result of what's going on in Europe. I think he's going to really struggle to beat that. So I think the third term is unlikely.
In that situation, does he start to reach out more to the Greens? If he starts moderating towards the Greens, he's got 3 years to build that relationship.
Here's the thing. John Key has spent 3 years already building up trust, demonstrating he's a moderate, showing that he won't lie. He won't promise asset sales, then not do them, or vice versa, right? So he's done that. Now, some people on the right hope and some on the left fear that he will now do some bold economic reforms to equip New Zealand to deal with the challenges we're facing. The problem is if he does that, he will upset somebody and he'll lose votes and he'll lose the next election. But on the other side, though, if he decides not to be innovative, because he has a license to be innovative, the public trusts him. That's what a license to be innovative is. But if he decides not to be innovative, then 3 years hence, if he says, I'm got a plan and a brighter future, well, the Labour Party will say, mate, we've been hearing that for 6 years. Where is it? So I think they're in trouble either way now.
I just take some issue with some of that, because I think actually, look, right now we've got 3 years, give or take, to go to the next election. What happens after is very much an open question. Okay, look, it's possible we go down, it's possible we go up. But if you look at the other parties, you've got the Labour Party there that's going to have to inevitably go through some kind of a teething, uncomfortable process to get to their next leader. Now, if they're smart, they'll do that over some time. I agree with, I've heard Matthew talk about, I agree with that. But actually in the short term, that's not necessarily good for them. So who's to say where they end up? They could foreseeably do worse. Actually, the Greens, how will they fare with Winston there hogging all their limelight? Winston, how will he go? So just where things go over the next 3 years, I think is very much an open.
National backed down on the mining of conservation land. They decided to review that after 50,000 Aucklanders marched on the street. If you had 50,000 marching on the street against asset sales, would that change it, or would you go, no, we're biting the bullet?
I doubt it very much, because we had a general election. We went in with a very clear policy. We haven't really left any room for ambiguity. Those 50,000, look, I think it's safe to say they weren't National Party voters at this election. So no, I can't see us backing down.
50,000 people on the street, that would spook them?
Well, I don't think you'd get that. I think the mining of conservation land is something which...
Spiritual.
Yeah, this is about the shares being issued on the share market that will be held by the New Zealand Super Fund, KiwiSaver funds,
And every overseas conglomerate.
No, because they're not going to be able to buy them. They're going to be oversubscribed, and I think you'll find the superannuation fund, KiwiSaver, and iwi will all be long-term.
And here's a prediction: what's going to happen? This will be a roaring success, and everyone. It's a bit like, you know, did you vote for MMP back in 1996? Everyone says no, I didn't. Look. What will happen? This will be a roaring success, and everyone will say, "Yeah, we always knew it was." What's going to happen
in terms of 2014? In terms of moving onwards, what should the National Party do with the Conservative Party? Do you think they should be talking?
Look, it's very, very interesting. I actually think if you go 2 or 3 things that are most profound things about this election, I'd say, look, Winston, of course, but that's obvious because he got back and most of us didn't think he would. I think National taking out West Auckland and Canterbury, and I think the Conservative Party is very, very interesting. Now, Matthew mentioned it before, and I think he was in some doubt about this, but I say, look, if you look at the polls, we were up over the 50s, we came back down to 48, 2.7-something%. Where did nearly all of those come from? Look, if I think about my electorate, I think they came from us, right? Okay. 1,500 people didn't vote for me as MP. They voted for the Conservative candidate in Tauranga. Now, that's a fair chunk. So what do we do? Well, it remains to be seen what Colin Craig will do, right? I mean, he spent $1 million or thereabouts to get himself this 2.74. Is he prepared to spend several million more to get himself over that 5%? I agree with Matthew's analysis. Actually, on social issues, they're probably to the right, but on economic issues, they're to the left. I've got to say, I've heard Colin Craig speak at a sensible sentencing trust function. I wasn't impressed. I felt like he was all over the place in terms of his criminal policy. So they've got a lot of testing to do. Let's just see where they come out in 2.5 years' time.
Matthew, one of the arts of John Key is that he spins everything as moderate. How will he use the Māori Party to make asset sales palatable, or will that come across as special treatment by National Party rank and file?
Well, what you've already seen since the election is Mark Solomon from Ngāi Tahu and other people involved in the iwi leaders group. They're establishing what is going to be called, I understand, the iwi consortium, and they wish to take 20% in at least one of these companies and be a long-term holder. And from the perspective of iwi, they see this as the treaty partnership coming together. This is electricity, and the Crown will own 51% under John Key's weak privatisation policy, quite frankly. Iwi will own another 20%, and probably ACC Super Fund will own the rest. So iwi see this as a tremendous opportunity to sort of make the treaty partnership mean something in a commercial sense, and I mean, that's going to be good.
Yeah. Before we start the canonisation of John Key, let's remind ourselves National Party strategic home goals during the campaign turned the sleepwalk to victory into squeaking home with a 1-seat majority. Simon, the Reno fiasco, the appalling opening and closing address, and the credibility-shattering mishandling of the Tea Party tapes suggested none of the finesse of Murray McCully. By barely winning, has Stephen Joyce's star dipped here?
Look, I think if we were in the Labour Party's position going into the election, a different campaign would have very much had to have been on the cards, right? I mean, I think you can make the argument, I of course wouldn't, but that our campaign was bland, sometimes boring in terms of those opening addresses and so on. There was some of that. But when you're in the winning pole position, I think that's the right strategy.
A win is a win?
Absolutely. And when you are winning and you're not trying to detract from that winning position, I think that's the right strategy to take. Look, the Labour Party, on the other hand, look, we let them sort of flop and fail all over the place. They said it was going to be about policy, then they found that wasn't working, suddenly it became about personality. So I don't think the strength or weakness of our campaign videos and so on, which frankly, how many people that are undecided watch, I don't think many made any difference.
Yeah, I'd like
Murray McCully wouldn't have allowed the teapot tape thing to have blown out the way it did. What happened here? Simon Joyce out of control?
Well, I think you've got to say it was quite strange that the leader of the National Party was brought a cup of tea, English breakfast tea, by the leader of the ACT Party. Surely, you know, it should have been a triple espresso. So the symbolism was
I was going to say, are you telling me that Banks paid? Keith's got more in his back pocket than Banks, hasn't he?
You know, it was a fiasco. It was organised poorly, and I think that it was just too cute. I think it would have been much better for the two of them to have a little press conference somewhere in the electorate and for it just to have been a simple endorsement. Everyone in the country knew what was going on. Why bother with the theatre? Because in the end it was the theatre that caused all the trouble. And I think people would have respected the whole situation a little more had it just been more transparent.
Look, if it wasn't the teapot fiasco, it would have been something else, right? And this idea that somehow Winston benefited on the back of that, look, if it wasn't that, it would have been something else that the media allowed Winston to grab hold of and run with. So I don't really buy the argument that that was here nor there, really. Right. My view is it wasn't here or there, really.
Matthew, how does National maximise its gains inside Auckland and across the provinces?
Well, it's got the Labour Party to thank for a lot of that because of how they've mispositioned themselves politically for a long period of time. Basically, John Key will need to continue his punishing travel around the country. I mean, he visits all parts of New Zealand constantly, and he should make sure puts West Auckland into that as much as possible, because this is historic. Make no mistake, National securing West Auckland makes and Canterbury, and in fact one of the Dunedin seats National won the party vote. The Labour Party has been reduced to South Auckland beneficiaries, civil servants in Wellington, and that's about it.
And this,
that's actually about
this
it
is
now.
actually the prime criteria for the next Labour Party leader. Will they be able to go into West Auckland pubs and have a beer with some working class people and get them to vote for them? Will they be able to, in Canterbury, go and sit next to a middle class housewife who's thinking about voting Green with their party vote? That's the criteria.
And the answer for both Cunliffe and Parker is no.
I think you're right.
I mean, David, we had the Trade Minister Tim Grosser, who stood against Cunliffe and New Lynn on the programme on Friday. I mean, he's an urbane he beat David Cunliffe for the party vote in New Lynn. If David Cunliffe can't beat Tim Grosser for the party vote in a single electorate, how on earth does he think he's going to get on?
I think you're right.
Do you think? I mean, Aucklanders clearly have bought into John Key's aspirational politics, but how well can that type of politics work in a recession?
Oh, look, I still think it works. I mean, I think Auckland is, it's a bit like Sydney, Melbourne, these countries. They're inherently aspirational. People want to get ahead. They want to go to the cool bar. They want to do these things. I think the ethnic mix plays into that. So I think the fact that Auckland is our most multicultural city, well, that's always going to lend itself, in my view, just as it has in America and Australia, to an aspirational kind of a politics. So I think, you go through, I'm a firm believer, cities have cultures. Auckland is basically a National Party culture. Tauranga, where I am, is a National Party culture. Hamilton goes either way. Dunedin and Canterbury, we've always said, have in some ways been Labour Party. What's interesting is, as we say, Canterbury actually went the other way this time around.
Which says something, the received wisdom was that the national government had handled Pike River well, but had somehow stuffed up the Canterbury earthquake situation. With Damien O'Connor winning the West Coast, but National doing incredibly well in Christchurch and Canterbury by historic standards, it actually suggests that received wisdom's wrong, that Jerry Brownlee has done a great job in Christchurch. Plus, I think it shows something about the maturity of Christchurch and Canterbury voters. I think they are the people who are closest to what's gone on in their city. They know how terrible it is, and they know there's no magic wand like the Labour Party was trying to promise.
Jerry Brownlee is a quiet big winner of this election.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cabinet, who does John Key put in there?
Well, there needs to be some assassinations.
There clearly has to
look,
be.
This next election...
There's a lot of dead wood there.
That got Michael Laws in trouble saying that.
Yes, well, yeah. But I think more people would support Matthew on
this win in 3 years' time is going to be incredibly difficult. National wins when it rejuvenates. I think there's a number of ministers. I think Kate Wilkinson would be one, and Tolly might be another. I think Jonathan Coleman has underperformed. Plus, there's been some retirements. I think he would be better. I mean, to go harder, make the cabinet reshuffle bigger than expected.
Ryle will hold on to health. He's done an amazing job
in health, and he won a majority in his electorate that has been noted. So I think the important thing is Key doesn't just keep in that dead wood, because in 3 years' time he's going to need fresh and new people, and Antolli, after 6 years, is not going to be in that category.
Who's in cabinet?
Well, I don't accept what Matthew said. I mean, I do accept the point that basically cabinets over time need rejuvenation. John Key accepts that, right? He's said, I think, in the Herald today, look, there will be some new blood, so that's the way he's going. But I mean, I think if you look at, for example, Kate Wilkinson, well, the lie to Matthew's argument is she just won Waimakariri, right?
Fair enough.
Fair enough. There's an example there, and I
but
think if you go through the other ones...
As a minister, has she performed? There have been times when she has been shown up to be, should we say, lacking.
Well, look, the Labour Party and the Green Party, for that matter, have really put the heater on her on Pike River. Actually, I think she's come through all right.
Thank you, panel. Let's wrap the show with final thoughts. Simon, your final thoughts for the election?
Yeah, look, as I say, I think the Winston Peters fact is very interesting. I agree very much with what Mike Williams has said, that we are talking about a one-man band, a cult of personality. Be interesting to see how the guys and girls underneath him perform, if at all. And I just come back to my other points. Look, the Conservative Party, I think, does help explain National doing sort of 48 rather than 50. And I come back again also to that other really critical point that Canterbury and West Auckland going Nationals ways are really big, potentially long-term game changers.
Your hopes to things you're attempting to achieve for the next 3 years?
Well, look, like John Key, I'm aspirational for New Zealand. I'd be lying if I said I'm not ambitious. I think the way you can make the most change is by moving up the greasy pole. I'm keen to do that, but we'll just have to see what's in John Key's mind.
Matthew, your final thoughts on the election 2011?
Well, I think the most important thing is just how close we were, despite having the most popular Prime Minister in New Zealand's history, who's kept his word and been incredibly truthful with the population. I mean, to his policy detriment, is how close we came to having a Labour, Green, New Zealand First, Mana Party and perhaps Maori Party government. And it just shows the dangers of MMP. And in fact, if it hadn't been for the somewhat dodgy dealing in Epsom, in my electorate, and in Ohario, we may well have had that bizarre government. And the fact of the matter is, I think it's most likely that after the next election, that is the government we're going to have. And so John Key has an enormous challenge ahead of him to both keep the country moving, or getting the country moving forward faster than he's done in his previous 3 years, while maintaining support. If anyone can do it, he probably can, but I hope that he doesn't think that the best thing to do is just be completely conservative, because we have some terrible challenges facing New Zealand. We've got some overseas problems about to hit us even harder than they have, and John Key will have to step up and be a bolder leader with a new team around him, or a newish team around him, if he's to be re-elected.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Matthew. To my final word, this election has been the saddest day for New Zealand democracy, not because Nationals scraped in with a one-seat majority and will claim that as a mandate to implement low-tax deregulation, Milton Friedman free market dogma to counter a global recession caused by that very same low-tax deregulation, Milton Friedman free market dogma. It was the saddest day for New Zealand because the last time voter turnout was this low was the 1880s. Women couldn't vote the last time voter turnout was this low. This is terribly dangerous to New Zealand democracy because large numbers of disenfranchised, unemployed youth feeling voiceless in a society is a recipe for the kind of political response Kyle Chapman and the right-wing resistance represent. Poverty and hopelessness for the marginalised are the challenge confronting our new government, and I send my best wishes to John Key in attempting to solve this malaise. I'll also send my vicious criticism if he doesn't. Thank you for joining us for this world-first experiment in political media election coverage. Thanks to Stratus TV, our crew of Debs, Tom and Will. Thank you to the iPredict team, our guests, Matthew Hooton, for managing not to get us taken to the Broadcasting Standards Authority. And of course you, the viewer at home. We hope we were able to discuss the election like adults with you. Good luck and good night, New Zealand.